Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers from every walk of life: sports, education, business, science, the arts, social impact, and more. Harmony Talk is brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Our guest today is Micah Dawanyi, author of 3 books, a nationally licensed soccer coach, and a much sought-after speaker on mental health and wellness. Micah was on track for a stellar sports career when he was derailed by a life-threatening heart complication. He quickly rebounded, however, by achieving his coaching license at a very young age, starting a nonprofit training business for underfunded communities in his home state of Florida, and launching a writing career. He is very focused on helping people overcome trauma and find hope and confidence. His latest publication, which debuted last year, is a work of fiction called When the Record Stops Spinning. It's a story of redemption and leaps of faith rolled into a lively science fiction adventure. I will add that Micah published all of his books while he was in school, attaining bachelor's and master's degrees. A very busy gentleman. Micah joins us from his home in South Florida. Thanks for being with us, Micah.
Thank you for having me, and that was a great intro. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with your latest book. It's about a young man, Cairo with a K, whose music career is cut short when he's shot at a party. He doesn't want that to define his life, but it has a grip on his ability to move forward. Then he meets a young scientist, Sahara, whose invention with a record player and music allows him to time travel, to relive the night of the party and see many more details than he initially remembered, including the identity of the shooter. What happens after that is action-packed, and I'm not going to give it away, and it's even thrilling. In other words, you've written a pretty good story. But you've also said that these kinds of tales are a good way of using fiction to talk about important issues. Can you tell us how this book came about and what you were trying to communicate?
Yes, thank you. So for me, I always start with an emotional landscape for my stories before I get into any plot or any really cool idea. It's always, what is the emotional journey? And I knew I wanted to write a story about grief, but more in terms of not the physical loss of life, more grieving a version of yourself that no longer exists. I think that's a very profound type of grief. And as you mentioned in the intro, I went through that as a soccer player. And the difficult thing with my heart complication is that the doctors never found the direct cause of what happened. So a lot of my grief came from the lack of closure. And I know what it's like to kind of long for a version of yourself that you can no longer access. So I wanted to funnel that through the story. So like you said, Cairo's a brilliant up-and-coming artist who is destined for greatness and then loses his ability to create through the tragic circumstance that he experiences. So I wanted to write a story about him navigating purpose and identity. Who am I without music? Who can I still become? And I also wanted to touch on the danger of being stuck in the past as well. As you said, I kind of play with the concept of time and revisiting the past. And I wanted to look at the past in terms of escapism and almost that outlet that we can go through for a sense of comfort. And although that can be kind of a beautiful thing, it can create kind of a longing and a desperation to cling to things that can't carry you into the future. So it's all about the emotional journey for me every time I set out to write. And that was kind of the goal for this story.
And there are, of course, a lot of people in the world who do kind of miss that version of themselves they imagined they would have, whether it's because of a shooting or some other. Well, let's go back to your book previous to that, Battle Scars and Blossoms. In that particular story, there's a fatal accident. The narrator's sister, I believe, was killed in an accident, and it has affected his life. So let's just talk about your 3 books, okay? The first one, which was called Step Into My Shoes, Memoirs from the Other Side of America, that was nonfiction. That was kind of about injustice and inequality. And then you moved on to 2 novels, 2 fiction stories, Battle Scars, and then, of course, When the Record Stops Spinning. What connects all 3 of those?
The goal has always been the same. My goal as a writer is to educate, enlighten, and empower with all that I do. And I only became a writer because I wanted to talk about things that were on my heart. I really enjoyed language arts class when I was a kid, but I never dreamed of just getting into stories for the sake of it. It came out of a necessity to talk about things that were affecting my world and the world all around us. And then I figured I could do that through writing. It was always one of my stronger subjects in school. I was the head writer of my high school yearbook program, and I was in a creative writing class. So I really enjoyed narrative. And so I think that became the trigger for me getting into writing. And so although I've pivoted from nonfiction to fiction, there's always going to be an important message in my work and something that can relate to kind of broader social commentary. That's kind of the goal for me.
Well, you actually kind of led into my next question, which was how did you go from being an athlete to being a writer? I mean, they're very different. I think you yourself have even spoken about the fact that as an athlete, a game is a game. You know, you win, you lose, you score, but in writing, it's not like that. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, the arts are just very subjective, but I think there are transferable skills. As an athlete, I became very disciplined because you have to train every day. I played very competitive soccer for an academy, and, it was traveling on the weekends. I couldn't go to parties with my friends because my team might be traveling 5 hours away to compete in a tournament. So I learned discipline. And I think in the arts, when you have a project, I always joke to my friends and I say that in the arts, we can kind of get lost in these really profound, beautiful quotes and not actually do the work. You can talk about, well, this pours into my soul and blah, 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 blah. But if you don't create, you can't materialize anything. I think as an athlete, I learned how to work, how to get stuff done. And that helps me as a writer. But yeah, like you said, they are a bit different. And I think losing the foundation of soccer, it cut so deep that it kind of made me feel like I had nothing to lose. And that actually gave me hope and encouragement to try something new like writing. It led into, speaking and illustrations and all this different stuff. But losing that foundation created the pathway to new foundations, which has been pretty great now.
But you are a soccer coach. Do you still do that?
So it's interesting. I only run clinics these days. Like I partner with companies sometimes and they'll have me come in and run weekend clinics, but I don't have that much time anymore because of the writing and the speaking and those things. But I am still nationally licensed. And so that's how I'm able to run clinics. But yeah, it's been hectic. So not as much as I'd love to.
You also, I believe, started a training business. Is that correct? And you received a humanitarian award in your community, the Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award, which congratulations, that's wonderful. Do you still have that business?
Yes, I do. That came out of my experiences playing soccer. I found that in soccer, there's this pay to play rule that you find, especially here in America, where a lot of academies, if you are a very talented player, you have to sign a contract with an academy and it becomes very expensive. The rates can kind of get up to what people pay for school and college sometimes. And there's a discrepancy there because if you're a talented player in other countries, I've often felt like there are great resources where they will take care of you if you're good. They'll get you a scholarship. They'll get you access to training. So I wanted to directly target that pay to play rule and go after communities where there are really talented players and individuals who may not be able to afford $80 per hour for training. So that was the goal of my nonprofit. And I started it right after I got my national coaching license to target those communities. And so it's been great to look at kids who have gone on to Division I college programs because of my training and just look at them have that access and get to be able to get to their next step. It's been really fulfilling.
So you're still doing that? That business still exists?
I am, yeah. Not as much as I would love to because of all the things I'm juggling, but it is still open, yeah. I do still work with people.
Returning back to the writing, I read a quote from you that really kind of blew me away, and that was that you don't really read.
Really? I said that.
You said your inspiration comes primarily from films, videos, and music. So if that is true, who or what in those realms inspires you the most? And maybe it is a book. Maybe you do read. I did read that, but reading isn't always accurate.
No, that is actually true, but I'll explain it like this. When I'm not writing, I read a lot. I think if you are a writer, you have to read because it makes you a better writer and it helps you appreciate different perspectives. So when I'm not working on any projects, I do read. But when I'm working on my own projects, I don't read that often. I probably should have explained that better. But yeah, I'm very inspired visually. It's actually funny, when I brainstorm my chapters, I use storyboard sketches to visualize my chapters so I don't outline as a typical writer would. So my process is very visual, so I'm very inspired by film and video. And I know even pivoting from nonfiction to fiction, a great source of inspiration was the Disney movie Soul. I watched that movie And I really liked the message of purpose and healing and finding who you are kind of rolled into this very complex fiction. And I was like, no, that's pretty inspiring that you can use fiction to still talk about important issues. And so that inspired me to write my second novel. And then I had a bunch of film inspirations for my third novel. And it's usually just a process of getting visual stimuli. And then I can start sketching my own ideas. So it's kind of transferable because I don't try to mimic what I see people do. It's more just I will get inspired by the way they do things and I want to kind of try to push boundaries in my own writing.
Well, when the record stops spinning definitely unfolds like a movie. I mean, there's even a car chase. I'm not going to give it away. It's a very thrilling, it's a very exciting book. So you just mentioned your third book. So you've got another one in the works?
I do, yes. I am sketching ideas for my fourth book. I'm working on the illustration for the cover because I always start there, is I sketch the cover first because, again, going back to visual stimuli, that just helps me feel like, okay, this is coming to life now. And then once I feel that motivation, I can write as long as it takes to get to the end product because I can now see it, So I'm working on concepts for my fourth book. I feel like I've kind of blended genres in some ways, but it'll probably be another kind of sci-fi fantasy, but with an important message again, and a different message.
Another story about a character kind of trying to break out of the former vision of himself or herself.
It's interesting. I've done that with my last two novels, and I've kind of wanted to avoid becoming formulaic. So I think one of the goals with my fourth book is to funnel that idea through a different plot element. So it may not be the main character. In the past, one of the pieces of advice I was given was write characters who are gravely mistaken and don't realize it, because we often are as humans. And I've really enjoyed that process. But I think it can kind of become a bit repetitive when you have a character who's gravely mistaken and then has to find out, oh, I was wrong about X, Y, and Z. But I think there are other ways to bring those moments to life. It doesn't have to be through the main character, but you can put broader social commentary through how a society deals with a project or an idea. So I have some ideas to make it a bit different this time, but you'll still see an idea, a major social commentary directly in the plot.
So when you're asked to speak, are you asked to speak about your books or about such issues as mental health stigma and inequality? What are some of the speaking engagements that you've been asked to do?
It's been interesting. Sometimes it's books. It's about my books. So sometimes it's like, we'd love to mass purchase your book and have you come in for a book club with our middle school or high school students. I've had that. There's a lot of private schools down here in the Boca area that I've worked with on book clubs. But then sometimes it's, let's have a mental health symposium on addressing the youth mental health crisis in our country, because that's a big topic right now. A lot of people are talking about the spiraling rates with anxiety and depression and even suicide amongst the youth. So I'm often asked to come in and speak about that. When my first book was out and I was doing press for that book, I was asked to speak a lot about injustice. I think these days, because I'm writing fiction, that's usually funneled more into the topic of like representation and storytelling. So I'm asked to speak about that sometimes. And then sometimes, because I also illustrate, I'm asked to speak about the process of sketching and how art imitates life. So it's kind of whatever people want, honestly. I think I've established myself as somebody that can speak about a few different things. So it depends on what the school or the event wants to work with, but I'm pretty open to being flexible.
Well, in your second book, Battle Scars and Blossoms, there is a therapist, and that I believe you have been asked to speak also about the importance of therapy.
Yeah. With my second book, I wanted to provide a direct attack to destigmatize therapy. And that came out of my experiences going to therapy when I was 17, when I was a freshman in college, and I was on my own for the first time away from home, processing my life up until that point. And I was pretty excited to go to therapy. And then when I would talk about therapy to other people, I was like, hey, I've been going to therapy. It's been really cool. And people were very uncomfortable talking about that. And I was like, oh, okay. But if I was to say I went to the doctor and got my wrist checked out, it'd be perfectly fine. So with like physical health, people were fine talking about it, but not mental health. And so I was like, we really need to destigmatize therapy and make it something normal. And you don't have to feel bad about going there or feel weird about going there. So that book Battle Scars and Blossoms, the main character is very ignorant about therapy. And it's kind of a journey for him to realize the importance of healing and working through his issues. And so that's been great to speak to kids about that, because I've seen kids who have become more open to therapy or even just speaking to a friend because of the characters in that book. So that's been pretty special.
It's interesting, too, because, forgive me, you're still in your 20s, so 17 to we're only talking a few years, and yet it still is somewhat stigmatized. But I think it's a little better now in terms of people, how they view therapy.
I agree. I think when I was younger, you're right, I'm in my early 20s now. And when I was younger, I never heard mental health talked about. But I think since maybe 2018, maybe even 2016, I've seen a lot of advancement in these conversations in the world of sports, in the arts and entertainment. I've seen like big actors and musicians talk about mental health. I've seen a lot of advancements, and I'm really glad, because I think the next generation will have a lot of terminology early on, and they won't have to work through things later on that they could have started dealing with at a younger age.
Do you find young people asking you about that a lot?
I do. And I think it's helpful that I'm not preaching at them. And that's kind of the beauty of writing fiction, is that all you have to do is fall into a world. But it's not me saying, hey, you're wrong for not dealing with mental health, and this is why you're wrong, because that's very alienating. So it's been really good for them to fall into the characters, and then they can ask me questions because they find comfort in the stories.
Something else that you're very versed in, I believe, is music. You just released the soundtrack to When the Record Stops Spinning. When I saw that, I was enchanted. And I'm glad that you included Adventures of a Lifetime by Coldplay, because that's a signature song in the book. But how do you go about choosing songs for a book?
So I try to capture what I think the characters would be listening to in a story. So it's usually looking at the emotional journey of the characters. So this book deals a lot with grief and heartbreak and isolation and struggling to figure out who you are and letting go of the past and missing people who are no longer a part of your life. And so there are a lot of songs that reflect those themes. So usually it's finding a collective soundtrack that can embody what the characters are going through. And I found that it's a very immersive experience for readers, because I just had a reader who finished the book and then was like, oh, you have a soundtrack to go with it. And they went to the soundtrack and they were like, oh, this song must be about when Cairo went through that, or blah, 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 blah. And I think music in itself is a universal language. That's part of the appeal of the book, but it also plays a part with the soundtrack. So that's been really fun.
Do you recommend that people listen to the soundtrack while they're reading the book, or go to it afterwards?
Good question. I would say after. I think it makes more sense after, because then you have the whole context and you're like, oh, okay. But before, in the middle, after, it's up to you. There's not really any major spoilers if you were to process the soundtrack first, but I do think it makes a lot more sense after.
So, okay, we've talked about creative writing, soundtracks, graphics, because you said that you learned how to illustrate and do the covers for your books. Are we talking movies in the future?
I would love to. And it's funny that you mentioned When the Record Stops Spinning feeling like a movie, because a lot of people have told me that. They're like, I could see this being a film. And it's interesting. Before I was an author, I didn't realize that about 75% of film and TV is novel adaptations. I don't think I knew that when I was younger. So I am at the point now where I'd love to see this stuff brought to life, especially because of what I'm using my work to talk about. And I know there's an audience that mainly goes for film, so you can reach people in a different way there. A lot of people don't read that often. I can be honest about that. And so I think I'd be able to reach kind of a different market with film. So I'd love to look at that in the future. I know through my master's program, I got to write my first screenplays for commercials. So that was like my entrance into kind of the visual writing. And so I'd love to move on to movies, even if I don't write it, because I think there are teams that have spent, a surplus of years dedicating themselves to writing. So even if I could just be a part of the experience, I'd love it.
Well, you'd have to see your character Cairo brought to life on the screen as you envision him.
Yes. Yeah. I think that'd be important.
So your fourth book, your third fiction book, will that also unfold like a movie?
Probably. I think that has more to do with my writing style than anything. because people have told me that it's just the way I write that makes it feel like you can see things visually. It could also be because I storyboard and I sketch out the scenes. So I look at it kind of like if I was to make it into a film, because I think in film, you often have to storyboard to get an idea of where the movie's going to go. So I'm sure it'll be similar. I think my writing style gets more immersive every time I write a new book because you learn new ways to illustrate, and I often say that when you're working in a medium with text only, you have to find a lot of creative ways to bring the words to life because you don't have a photo, you don't have audio that you can kind of inject into the book. It's text. And so you have to get very creative. So I think it will. I think it'll be fun and definitely visual.
How long does it take you to write a book?
It's changed every time. I was just saying at an event that the better I get as a writer, the longer it takes, which is ironic because usually when you get better at something, you can do it faster. Battle Scars and Blossoms took about 4 months of brainstorming and then about 6 months to write. When the record stopped spinning, took about a year and a half, but on and off, because I did the cover first, and then I sat on the cover and I let ideas kind of marinate for a while. So I changed a bit of my process because I used to get very excited about writing and go with my first idea. But what I did with my third book was I said, okay, if I have an idea, let me just let it marinate and evolve into something more complex. And so the music idea, the idea of exploring time through music, that came as I let the idea marinate in my head. So that time I wasn't actually writing anything, but I was kind of letting the process work itself out. And then I was able to write. So yeah, about a year and a half, but on and off.
Where did the character Sahara come from? She's the young scientist, of course.
Yes, she was actually the first character I wrote. I knew that if I was going to explore time travel through music, there'd be two possibilities, either practical or magical. Those are the two ways I thought it could happen. I wasn't very interested in magical. I was like, I could have an idea where they find some like magical device that just works because it works. But I thought if I made it practical, I could have a reason for the scientist inventing it, and I could tie it to that character's own emotional struggles. So that's where Sahara came in. I knew it'd be cool to have a young scientist, and I've seen a lot of stories, it's in the book even, where you'll see a headline like 18-year-old student discovers X, Y, and Z. And I was like, it'd be pretty fun to have one of those characters in my book. So that's where she came into play.
Well, she's a great character. And of course, she does have her own background to battle with. She has a backstory as well.
That's what I enjoyed because whenever I see scientists, sometimes in films, sometimes you can get a one-dimensional character that's like only interested in science. And that's the only way they can service the story. So I knew, especially as a young woman in the story, I knew it was important to have her be a complex character who's not serving the male lead just to be a servant, who has their own dynamism that can add to the story and contributes in a meaningful way. So I was thinking about all of that as soon as I came up with her character.
That's great. So you're writing your next book, and that's what you're doing? You're not thinking yet about film. What kind of advice would you give somebody aspiring to do some of the things that you're doing?
I would say give it a little bit of thought and then jump into the water. There's a line in the book where one of the characters, I think it's Cairo, says he's trying to make a move in his life. And he says, I don't want to overthink myself into paralysis. And I wrote that line because I have been there. And if you think about something for too long, you can find a reason not to do it. Because I will do that. If I have a cool idea, if I let it marinate for too long, I'll be like, no, that's probably too crazy, or I may not be skilled enough. So I think if you want to get into some of the things I've done and you have that passion and that fire, give it a bit of thought just to make sure you have a strategic plan, but then just jump. Because a lot of the stuff you're going to learn is not going to happen until you act. There can only be so much that you know in advance, but you have to act. You have to be decisive. And if you feel scared, you can feel scared and continue anyways. I feel scared all the time and I do stuff while I'm scared. You can do that.
You got to finish. You got to get to the finish line.
Yeah. So that's where I think having the clear vision helps.
One of the things that you talked about in another interview that I had read was toxic productivity. Do you remember talking about that? Maybe you could tell us what that means exactly.
I think I was more leaning to the concept of placing a lot of your self-worth in the things you do and then saying to yourself, I have value in the world because I did X, Y, and Z this day. I think that can lead to burnout culture. And so it could be kind of hypocritical for me to say that given that I'm doing a lot of things, but I'm not killing myself to do these things. And I'm a multidimensional person regardless of the work I do. Even if I wasn't an author, I'm a brother, I'm a son, I just became an uncle. Like I have a life outside of being productive. So I think it's just about having a healthy relationship with your productivity. And as I've let that concept evolve, I've realized it's also important to have good motivations for your productivity. So like for me, it's more self-love in a way. Like I want to work hard because beautiful things can happen when I work hard, but I don't want to work hard because if I don't work hard, then I'm going to hate myself and feel really bad. I think that's more of an unhealthy way to look at productivity. So I think it's more about the relationship. Everyone's going to have their own relationship, but I just advise people to be really careful on how much of your self-worth you attach to the monetary things that you do.
So has Micah Dawanyi shed his initial vision of himself as a famous soccer player and embraced this new life? Because it certainly sounds like you have, and you're doing a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. I would say yes. I did grieve for a while. I grieved that version of myself. And it's funny, I have about 6 kids from my academy now who are professionals. And so I'm able to watch them on the TV. Some are in Europe, some are playing in like the major league in America here. But I've been able to grieve and make peace with what happened to me. So it's all love at this point. I appreciate what they're doing. I'm inspired by them, but I don't feel any ill will about not being with them on that stage. And I think I've fallen so deeply into the world of art that I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. I'm thinking about stories all day. I'll be at the checkout line at the grocery store like, ooh, I just got a good line. Let me go write this down. So I've fallen into this world.
Sounds like a writer.
Yeah. So I think it's great. I think I'm comfortable where I am.
Well, that's terrific, and we wish you the best of luck in the future. I look forward to your next book. Thank you so much for being with us. It was a joy talking to you. It really was. I really do wish you luck, Micah.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. This has been a podcast brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business founded in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Talk to you next time.